because we need his help here. Can the pandemic be over in months instead of years? Do you need a booster? Why are more vaccinated people in the hospital? And we're going to get to other questions that cannot be answered by that anonymous person on Twitter who learned their information from the Google Research Institute of Google Research. But we are going to go to an epidemiologist instead, someone who has an education on this. And something I just discovered that probably doesn't have much to do with our conversation at hand, but I'm keen to learn more. Published fiction writer. Is this true, Dr. Ray Deonandan?
It is true, and you got me by surprise, yes.
How come we've talked about your fabulous hair? We haven't talked about this published fiction that you have.
Yeah, before I was a scientist, I was a budding novelist, and I did quite well. I've written a bunch of books. One of them won the National Book Award of the Nation of Guyana, and I've got some Canada Council grants and stuff like that. But you know what? Being a writer doesn't pay the bills, as I'm sure many of your listeners understand. So science came beckoning, and it was more rewarding financially and publicly. Yes, let's leave it that way. Let's leave it at that.
You know what's interesting is I think so many people think science, like scientists are so straightforward science. There is so much art to science. Science is actually like an art, I think, it's almost like it comes full circle, right? Art and science, it's not a spectrum like right and left. It's a spectrum where it's a circle, and there's a point where the two almost meet, I think.
If you do it right, I believe there should not be a distinction between the two. All scholarship is scholarship. All intellectual activity should be cross-pollinated with both left and right brain endeavors. And those who stay in their silos of a type of thinking ultimately do a disservice to their own intellectual growth. That is my lecture.
That was and Professor too, Professor Ray Deonandan. All right, so we have to get to this because I'm wondering, I saw about a month ago, and I don't even know if he's a famed epidemiologist, but USA Today calls this man a famed epidemiologist. His last name, really, I think it's just based on his last name alone. His name is Larry Brilliant. And Larry Brilliant said, the world is nowhere near the end of the COVID pandemic, that the Delta variant of the virus might be the most contagious virus of all time. What are your thoughts on this? And is he a famed epidemiologist?
He is a famed epidemiologist. He was part of the team that got rid of smallpox, so we take him seriously. It's an important quote that he made there. First of all, is the Delta variant the most contagious respiratory virus of all time? Maybe it's up there, probably not quite as bad as he says. He was alluding that it's as contagious as chickenpox. That was one of the suspicions earlier in the year. It's very contagious, maybe not quite as contagious as chickenpox, but certainly quite up there. Now, are we near the beginning than the end? We have to remember that pandemics are global endeavors. We tend to think of this as something that just affects us and our community and our nation. Of course, it's a global affair. Globally, this thing is going to rage on for some time, for a number of reasons. The most important reason being we don't have an equitable distribution of the tools needed to suppress it quickly. Locally, however, there is a chance that we are done the most of this in a matter of months, for a number of reasons. The most important reason is here in Canada and in Ontario, where I live, we have a really good vaccine uptake, getting better every day because of tools like vaccine passports that encourage people to accept vaccine, and also because this is a dangerous thing to say, but because Delta is so contagious, it's going to tear through the unvaccinated population relatively quickly and leave in its wake the gift of immunity at a high price. So a combination of high vaccination and recovery means that there might be sufficient immunity in the population in a number of months that we won't be in crisis anymore, here in Canada. Now, the rest of the world, really, we can't afford to let it tear through the entire world like that, because the percentage of people who would be hospitalized and killed would be way too high, almost at the level of a world war. For the rest of the world, what we can do is really advocate to make vaccine production and distribution a Manhattan Project level endeavor. If we do that and distribute these things really quickly, we can get done in months, I think. Because imagine the most remote corners of the poor world suddenly experiencing remarkable amounts of immunity resilience in a matter of 2, 3, 4 months rather than 2, 3, 4 years. So that's before us. We're at an interesting time now in the pandemic. A year ago, we were at the mercy of the virus. Right now, I think we're at the mercy of ourselves. We have the tools to defeat this. We just lack the political will and the public enthusiasm to do so. End of lecture.
You know, no. We're going to continue this lecture because, I talk to you about this, and this is what you say, and then I could talk to another epidemiologist, and they'll say, you know what, we've got to learn to live with this virus. We've got to learn to live. So I feel as though people are confused, and they choose to believe what they want to believe. You're going to pick the belief pattern, whether it's whether you want to live in this misery of thinking that there's this doom and gloom hanging over you, and some people like to live in that state, right? You could be in a certain type of mental health situation where you're going to choose those states that put you in more of a doom and gloom position. And so you could read, hey, this is something that you've got to learn to live with. You could read, hey, this is something that we just need the political will and we could end this in months. Even as an epidemiologist, are you ever taken aback yourself and you're thinking, okay, well, where is this at? Because some of my colleagues are saying this, some of my colleagues are saying this. Are you confused too sometimes?
Well, first off, most of my colleagues are saying more or less the same thing. And let's back up and define what we mean by living with the virus. That doesn't mean tearing open the doors and say, let the virus have its way with society. Now, a handful of people are saying that, and we can talk about them if you like. But most are saying at some point this will be an endemic disease. An endemic disease just means there is a steady state of background transmission at all times, but no more waves that threaten the closure of society. So the common cold is endemic. The flu is kind of endemic with some seasonal patterns associated with it. These things don't shut down society. With sufficient vaccination and some clever choices with reopening, we can get to the endemic phase in a comfortable manner to the point where when COVID does happen, amongst that extremely small handful of people that will still be vulnerable, it won't be a life-threatening endeavor for the most part anymore. We won't be afraid of it anymore. So that's what living with the virus means to myself and to many of my colleagues. It won't magically go away. It'll just be manageable to the point where most citizens don't have to think about it. Now, will it magically go away? Maybe in a few years, depending upon how evolution has its way with the virus. But for those who say that we should be throwing the doors open and looking at other options rather than restricting society, I hear where they're coming from. But what's missing from that calculation is the unnecessary amounts of suffering that we could avoid. And my perspective is, if you can avoid human suffering and death, why wouldn't you? Even if it costs a bit of money. And that's what we're talking about here, financial cost, and almost nothing else.
It's funny, you asked the question, if you could avoid losing human life, if you could avoid death, why wouldn't you? If you look at the debate last night, they're talking about book burning instead of the basic needs of life. So I think that we understand where the political will is at. Dr. Raywat Deonandan is with us right now. This is Good Mornings. I'm Dahlia. I want to get to how you feel about the third vaccine, and I have a couple more questions. But I also wonder: do you see a point? Do you see a time when masks will be off? We're not going to wear masks anymore. I feel as though this is the barrier that makes someone feel as though the times are not whatever the word normal means to an individual. I feel as though the mask is the barrier that's causing problems. How do you feel about masks? How long do you think they'll be around?
First off, cast our minds back to the Spanish flu or other great pandemics where these kinds of mitigation measures were in place for much longer. Spanish flu lasted a number of years. We've been in this for under 2 years, and we're already itchy to cast away all our mitigation strategies. We just haven't got the patience that our civilizations once had. Masks will not be interminable in the sense that they'll be mandatory. I had a bet with my spouse a number of months ago that we wouldn't have a mask mandate by Christmas. She says we will. I said we won't. I think she might be right. I didn't anticipate the rise of Delta, and she kind of did, so she's smarter than me. But I think the mask mandate will be gone sometime next spring. Now, masks, I think, are going to be with us as part of our culture, perhaps permanently. And by that I mean when you ride the subway or the bus or go to work and someone's wearing a mask, you won't think it's weird. You'll think, hey, that person is sick today and they're protecting the rest of us. Much like we see in Asia. That's part of the culture there. And that's being imported here. So in that sense, masking isn't going away. But masking mandates, of course, are not permanent. They're going to go away in a matter of months once we get this thing under control, as we will in a matter of months.
How do you feel about the third vaccine, third booster?
Yeah, that's a tough one, right? So here's the challenge, is how do you measure waning immunity? Most of the studies are looking at antibody levels, but antibodies aren't the end of the story. Every vaccine experiences waning antibody levels after a few months, but your body has two arms of immunity, the antibody arm and the cellular arm, as we call it, the T cells and so forth. And the second arm lasts much longer, perhaps even lifetime. And what that means is while the antibody arm prevents initial infection, that goes away after a few months. Once you've been infected, the cellular arm can prevent serious disease. So we might not need additional boosters to prevent serious disease. And we have these things called B cells, which allow your body to produce new antibodies once they see the virus again. So again, our immune systems are complicated and more robust than we give them credit for. Having said all that, there is a subpopulation, the elderly, the immunocompromised, who could use a third dose. For them, this wouldn't be a booster. This would be part of the prime series, as we call it. They just didn't mount a sufficient reaction the first time around, so we want to make sure they get it. Now, ultimately, should we get a third dose? Yeah, maybe. When the world has been vaccinated, we could look into getting a third dose to make us extra superhuman immune, maybe even preventing the worst of transmission rather than the worst of disease. But my feeling is we should prioritize getting a first and second dose into the rest of the world so that the overall emergency goes away faster. The WHO has some guidance on this. They say that no country should be talking about a third dose for the general population until the world has reached 10%, and the world is nowhere near 10% immunized yet. So we cannot let this percolate in the corners of the world where large numbers of people gather, because that's where new variants will arise, and new variants eventually will produce one that challenges our vaccine effectiveness. We don't want that. That's catastrophic. So it's in our best interest to push vaccines outward before we push it more inward on those who are already immunized.
So what about people who say this is an infringement on their personal rights to get vaccinated? What do you say to them?
No one is strapping them down and forcing an injection into them. They're saying if you don't get vaccinated, you can't experience some aspects of society with the same amount of ease as you used to. That's an important ethical distinction. No one's being forced, you're just being restricted. We already restrict people from doing things based upon their choices. You can't cross the street anywhere you want. You got to wait for the green light. You can't drive a car unless you've got a license. You got a license, you can't drive the car as fast as you want. We restrict that. So every step of the way, we restrict people's movement in a free society so that the greater common good is achieved. Nothing is new here. And if you don't want to get vaccinated, and I hope you do, I think there's going to be a price to pay. I didn't get a driver's license until later in my life, and I paid a price. I had to take public transit everywhere until I learned to drive, then, that I can drive more. So by the same token, if you choose not to get vaccinated, life is going to be harder for you in the sense that barriers will be put in your way. That's not unusual, and it's not unethical.
So last question right now, as people are hearing about this new wave and kids are back in school and you feel as though, last year when kids went back to school, everything started to fall apart again. The weather gets colder, things change. What's going to happen over the course of the next few months? What's your prediction?
That's a tough one. And here are the challenges. We have vaccination, extremely good uptake of vaccination. We need to do better. But that vaccination uptake is not homogeneously distributed across the population. We have pockets of vulnerability amongst the unvaccinated. And the single largest block of unvaccinated people are kids under 12. So we're going to see outbreaks in schools, absolutely. The question is, will those outbreaks lead to hospitalizations? Some will. Will they lead to deaths? I really hope not. I think, though, that we learned over the past year that we need to invest more resources and attention on keeping schools open, meaning throw everything at it. Throw screening tests, throw vaccinated adults in that environment, throw rapid tests. More and more school boards are using rapid tests to keep infectious people out of the school system. If that is done at scale, I have confidence that we can keep the schools open and keep everything open, frankly. But the key is always going to be, if you're an adult, get vaccinated, because that helps kids not get sick.
If people want to learn more information, not from the anonymous person on Twitter, but actually from someone who went to school for this and who just happens to be a published fiction writer and has a podcast, how can they find out more?
Well, if you want to follow me, my website is mylastname.com, deonandan.com. I do blog on these issues. But proper COVID information can be found at university websites. Johns Hopkins has a great website, for example. I mean, the CDC and WHO are pretty good. They've made some errors in the past, but people tend not to trust government officials these days. So I push them towards the university websites. They're the best. And if you want to follow me, feel free to do so. I say silly things, so don't take me seriously all the time.
I think that the people who say silly things are the ones you should take most seriously, though. That's the best part, because you don't take yourself seriously, and you know you're going to get good information from someone who's uninhibited like that. Dr. Ray Deonandan, the guy with the coolest hair in epidemiology, even though you shaved it,
I shaved it off.
Still there. It's there. It's in there. Thank you so much for taking your time to join us today.
It's my pleasure. Thank you so much.
And coming up...